1943. A German anti-aircraft battery, somewhere in the Reich, and the crew is doing everything right, and it is not enough, and they cannot fully understand why. The American bombers are overhead. The gunners can see them, tiny silver crosses, glinting in the high sunlight, crawling across the sky in their tight formations. The guns are good, the crews are trained, the fire control calculations are sound, and the shells are climbing, bursting, filling the sky with black puffs of flak, bursting below the bombers. Not by a little. The bombers are up there, higher than the flak can effectively reach, sailing along in the thin, cold air near the top of the sky, while the shells expend themselves in bursts that blossom beneath them, short of the target, the fragments falling back to Earth without ever touching the aircraft that fly on. Serene and almost contemptuous, far above. If you were a German flak gunner, this was a maddening, demoralizing experience. And it was not a matter of your skill. You were doing everything correctly. The problem was altitude. The bombers were simply flying higher than your guns could effectively engage. High enough that the shells lost their energy and accuracy before they reached that height. High enough that the whole geometry of anti-aircraft fire broke down. And you knew, with a gunner's precise understanding, that an aircraft flying that high was extraordinarily difficult to hit, because everything about anti-aircraft fire gets harder the higher the target flies. And this raised a question that should have troubled you deeply because it pointed at a capability you could not easily match. How were the Americans flying so high? Because flying very high is not easy. It is, in fact, one of the hardest things in aviation, and it fights against the fundamental physics of engines and human bodies alike. As an aircraft climbs, the air grows thin, and thin air is the enemy of everything. It starves the engine, which needs air to burn its fuel, and loses power as the air thins, until at high altitude, an ordinary engine is gasping, feeble, unable to keep a heavy bomber flying. And it starves the men, whose bodies cannot function in air too thin to breathe, who lose consciousness and die in the thin air near the top of the sky, without protection. High altitude is a hostile, killing environment, for machines and men both, and flying a heavy bomber up there, hour after hour, is a profound technical challenge. So the American bombers, sailing along above the reach of your guns, were not simply flying high as a matter of choice. They were flying high as a matter of enormous technical achievement, solving, at industrial scale, the intertwined problems of keeping engines powerful and men alive in an environment that wants to kill both. And the fact that they could do it, routinely, in massed formations of heavy bombers, was a sign of a technical and industrial capability that you, watching your shells burst uselessly below them, were up against and could not overcome by skill or courage. The conclusion available to you was frustration shading into a grim understanding. The enemy had found a way to live and fight in a part of the sky you could not effectively reach, and the shells bursting beneath his bombers were the visible proof that on this particular battlefield, the high, cold, thin air near the top of the sky, he held an advantage you could not take from him. This is not a story about altitude. This is a forensic audit of the immense technical achievement of high-altitude flight, of the devices that let engines breathe and men survive in the killing thin air near the top of the sky, and of how American industry mastered that achievement at a scale that let its bombers fly, routinely, above much of what the German defenses could do to stop them. Part 1. The German Calculus. We have to begin by understanding that the German difficulty here was real and was rooted in physics, and that the Germans understood the physics perfectly well. Their failure, as always, was not one of knowledge but of the industrial capacity to solve the problem at scale. Start with the anti-aircraft problem, because that is where our story opened. Hitting a high-flying aircraft is brutally difficult, and it gets harder with every 1,000 feet of altitude, for reasons rooted in the basic nature of the problem. A shell fired at a very high target takes longer to get there, during which the aircraft moves further, making the aim less certain. The shell loses velocity and energy as it climbs, so at extreme altitude it arrives with less power, and its burst is less effective. The margins for error in the fuse timing grow, and the sheer distance makes everything less precise. All of this means that as a target climbs higher, the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire against it falls off dramatically, until at the very high altitudes the American heavy bombers used, effective engagement became extremely difficult. The Germans built superb, powerful anti-aircraft guns, some of them specifically designed to reach high altitudes, and they threw an enormous organization and a staggering quantity of shells at the high-flying bombers. And they did bring bombers down, in significant numbers, because even difficult fire, in enough quantity, scores hits. But the fundamental difficulty of engaging very high targets meant that the bombers flying at extreme altitude were far harder to hit than they would have been lower down, and the sheer height of the American bombing was, in itself, a form of defense, a way of degrading the effectiveness of the flak by operating at the edge of, or beyond, its useful envelope. And there is a hidden cost here that is worth pausing on, because it reveals something about the whole strategic picture. The German flak defense was colossal. An enormous organization, vast numbers of guns, and staggering quantities of ammunition, all consumed in the effort to bring down the high bombers. And precisely because the bombers flew so high, the number of shells required to down each one was enormous, running into the thousands of rounds per kill. This meant the high-altitude bombing imposed a huge cost on Germany merely by existing, forcing the diversion of vast quantities of guns, ammunition, and manpower to air defense, guns and men that could otherwise have served at the front. The high-flying bomber, hard to hit, drained German resources on a massive scale, simply by forcing Germany to try to hit it. The altitude did not only protect the bombers, it made the German defense against them ruinously expensive, a further hidden victory folded inside the visible one. So the Germans understood exactly why the high-flying bombers were hard to hit. The question that mattered was the one from the other side. Why could the Americans fly so high? And why could the Germans not simply do the same, or build defenses that fully coped with it? And the answer lies in the two intertwined technical problems of high-altitude flight, both of which the Germans understood, and neither of which they could fully master at the scale required. The first problem is the engine. An ordinary aircraft engine loses power as it climbs because it has less and less air to burn. To maintain power at high altitude, you need a way to force more air into the engine, to compress the thin, high-altitude air back up to something the engine can use. This is the job of a supercharger, and in its most effective high-altitude form, the Turbocharger, or Turbocharger, a device that uses the engine's own exhaust to drive a compressor that force-feeds dense air into the engine, restoring its power at altitudes where an unaided engine would be gasping. The turbocharger is what lets an engine perform at high altitude, and building effective, reliable turbochargers and building them in enormous quantity is a formidable precision manufacturing challenge. The second problem is the men. At the altitudes the heavy bombers flew, the air is too thin to breathe and the cold is lethal. Temperatures far below freezing, cold enough to kill exposed flesh in minutes. Keeping a crew alive and functioning up there requires oxygen systems to let them breathe, and heated suits or other protection against a cold that would otherwise kill or cripple them, and a whole array of equipment to sustain human life in an environment as hostile, in its way, as the bottom of the sea. Solving this, and equipping entire fleets of bombers and their crews to survive and function in the killing thin cold air, is an enormous undertaking. And here is the German calculus. The Germans understood both problems completely. German engineering was fully capable of grasping turbochargers and oxygen systems and high-altitude flight. These were not mysteries. But mastering them at scale, building reliable turbochargers in vast quantity, equipping whole fleets for sustained high-altitude operations, required exactly the industrial capacity, the precision manufacturing base, and the material abundance that Germany was short of. And Germany's strategic situation did not push it in that direction. Germany was not running a massive strategic bombing campaign requiring fleets of high-altitude heavy bombers, so it had neither built the industrial base for high-altitude heavy bombing nor the fully adequate means to defeat an enemy who had. The Germans were, in a sense, caught out of position, facing a high-altitude threat they understood perfectly, but had neither the industrial base to replicate nor the complete means to defeat. That is the German calculus. A perfect understanding of why high-flying bombers were hard to hit, and of the technical problems of high-altitude flight, combined with the inability to master those problems at the industrial scale the Americans achieved, and a strategic situation that left them defending against a high-altitude capability they could not themselves match. Now let us look at how the Americans conquered the top of the sky. Part 2. The American answer. The American mastery of high-altitude flight was, like everything in this series, a marriage of technical solutions with industrial scale, and it rested on solving both of the great problems, the engine and the men, and solving them not once but by the thousand. Start with the engine and the turbocharger, because it is the technical heart of the story. The American heavy bombers, the famous four-engine bombers that carried the Daylight campaign, were equipped with turbo superchargers that let their engines maintain power at very high altitude. This was what allowed them to fly and fight in the thin air near the top of the sky, where an unaided engine would have failed. The turbocharger force-fed dense air into the engines, using the energy of the exhaust, restoring at high altitude the power that would otherwise have bled away, and it was one of the key technologies that made high-altitude heavy bombing possible. And building turbochargers is hard. They are precision devices operating under extreme conditions, spinning at enormous speeds, handling searing exhaust gases, demanding high-quality materials, and precise manufacturing. Building one is an achievement. Building them reliably, in the vast quantities needed to equip thousands of four-engine bombers, each with multiple engines, each engine with its turbocharger, is an industrial feat of the first order. And American industry did exactly that, mass-producing turbochargers in the enormous numbers required, applying the same mass-production genius to this precision device that it applied to everything else. The turbocharger is another entry in the same ledger as the proximity fuse and the tank radio. A complex, demanding precision device, mass-produced at a scale that turned a technical capability into a fleet-wide reality. Then the men, because a bomber that can fly high is useless if its crew cannot survive up there. The Americans equipped their bomber crews with the systems to live and function in the killing high-altitude environment. Oxygen systems let them breathe in air too thin to sustain life. Electrically heated flight suits protected them against a cold that would otherwise have frozen them. Temperatures dozens of degrees below zero, cold enough that exposed skin could suffer terrible injury in moments. The whole apparatus of high-altitude survival, oxygen, heat, protective equipment, was developed, manufactured, and supplied to entire fleets of bombers and their crews, so that 10 men in a heavy bomber could work their guns and their instruments and their bomb sights for hours in an environment near the top of the sky that would kill an unprotected man quickly. And even with all of this, high-altitude operations were brutally hard on the men, and we should be honest about that, because it is part of the story, and it connects to the human cost we have discussed before. Crews suffered from the cold despite the heated suits, from oxygen system failures that could kill silently, from frostbite, from the sheer punishing difficulty of functioning at extreme altitude for hours. The high sky was never a comfortable place, and the men who fought there paid a price for it, even when no enemy touched them. But the American system made it survivable and workable on a fleet-wide scale, and that was the achievement. Not that high-altitude flight was easy, but that American industry made it routinely possible for masses of bombers and crews. Put the two together, engines that could breathe at altitude through mass-produced turbochargers, and men who could survive at altitude through mass-produced life support equipment, and you have the capability that so frustrated the flak gunner. Heavy bombers operating in massed formations at altitudes that degraded the effectiveness of the defenses, flying above much of what the flak could do, in the thin, cold air that American technology and industry had made into a workable battlefield. The Germans understood the top of the sky perfectly well. The Americans built the machines and the equipment to own it, and mass-produced them until entire fleets could live and fight where the flak burst uselessly below. Part 3. The River of Steel. The high-altitude capability connects to the deepest themes of this channel, and it is worth tracing those connections, because altitude is not a separate story from everything else. It is the same story, told in the thin air near the top of the sky. It connects first to the theme of precision devices mass-produced. The turbocharger, like the proximity fuse and the universal tank radio, is a complex, demanding piece of engineering that only becomes a war-winning capability when it can be mass-produced reliably in enormous quantity. America's genius was never only invention. The turbocharger drew on international development, but the ability to manufacture these demanding devices by the thousand, reliably, and equip entire fleets with them. High-altitude flight required turbochargers by the tens of thousands, and America made them, and that manufacturing capacity was the true foundation of the capability. It connects to the theme of keeping the ordinary man alive and functioning. The oxygen systems and heated suits that kept bomber crews alive at altitude are cousins of everything we have seen. The medical system, the survivable tank, the winter clothing, the whole American determination to keep the ordinary fighting man alive and functional in hostile environments. The high-altitude life support equipment was one more expression of the conviction that the crew was a valuable asset to be preserved, equipped, and sustained, even in an environment as lethal as the top of the sky. The Americans did not simply send men to freeze and suffocate. They built the systems to keep them alive up there, because the men mattered. It connects to the strategic bombing campaign we examined in earlier episodes, the whole daylight bombing effort, the B-17s and B-24s carrying the war into Germany, the campaign that forced the German fighter force up to be destroyed by the escorts. The strategic pressure on German industry depended on the ability to fly high. High altitude was one of the bomber's key defenses, degrading the flak and complicating the fighter interception. Without the high-altitude capability, the whole daylight campaign would have been even more costly than it was. The turbocharger and the oxygen mask were, in that sense, strategic technologies, enabling the entire high-altitude bombing effort that pressed on Germany from above. And it connects, above all, to the theme of industrial abundance, converting technical possibility into overwhelming reality. Any advanced nation could build a turbocharger or an oxygen system. Only a nation of America's industrial capacity could build them in the quantities needed to put fleets of thousands of high-altitude heavy bombers over Germany, each with its turbochargers and its life support systems, replacing losses and expanding the force relentlessly. The high-altitude capability was, at bottom, an industrial achievement, the mass production of the technologies of high flight. And it was the same industrial abundance that produced everything else in this series, applied to the conquest of the top of the sky. The flak gunner watching the bombers sail along above his shells was watching the visible result of an invisible industrial achievement, the mass production of turbochargers and oxygen systems and heated suits that had made the high sky into an American highway, along which the heavy bombers flew, hour after hour, above much of what he could do to stop them. Part 4. The German Realization. The German realization about high-altitude flight was, like the flak bursting below the bombers, a daily and visible frustration that pointed at a deeper truth they understood but could not overcome. German flak gunners and their commanders understood perfectly well that the high altitude of the American bombers was degrading their effectiveness. They knew the physics. They could see the results. They responded with the tools available. More guns, more shells, larger caliber weapons, designed to reach higher, ever more ammunition poured into the sky. And the enormous German flak organization did take a real toll on the bombers, because even difficult fire in sufficient quantity brings aircraft down. But they could not fully solve the problem, because the fundamental difficulty of engaging very high targets could not be eliminated, only partly compensated for, and the bombers kept flying high, above the most effective envelope of the defenses. And the deeper German realization was the familiar one, arriving from the sky this time. They were facing an enemy who had mastered a technical capability, sustained, massed, high-altitude heavy bombing, that they could not themselves replicate and could not fully defeat. It was not that German engineers could not understand turbochargers or oxygen systems. They understood them completely. It was that the Americans had built the industrial capacity to mass-produce these technologies and field entire high-altitude bomber fleets, and Germany had neither built that capacity nor developed a complete answer to an enemy who had. The high-flying bomber was one more thing the Germans understood and could not match, because matching it required an industrial scale they did not possess. And there is a poignant dimension to the German position here, which is that Germany actually pursued high-altitude technology in various forms and understood its importance, and even developed advanced high-altitude and high-speed aircraft late in the war. But these came too late, in numbers too small, from an industry being bombed and starved, fielded by a pilot corps being destroyed. The German capacity to understand and even to innovate in high-altitude flight was real. The capacity to mass-produce and field it decisively was not. And by the time the problem became acute, the war was already being lost in the very sky the high bombers ruled. The deepest German understanding, available to the perceptive, was that the high-flying bomber was a symbol of the whole war's fundamental imbalance. The enemy could take a difficult technical problem, flying and fighting at the top of the sky, and solve it at industrial scale, fielding thousands of high-altitude bombers, while Germany could understand the problem perfectly and yet lack the industrial base to match the solution. The flak bursting below the bombers was, in miniature, the whole war. German skill and understanding, real and formidable, defeated by an American industrial capacity that could convert technical possibility into overwhelming fleet-wide reality. The flak gunner, watching his well-aimed shells fall short beneath the serene silver formations, was looking at the visible edge of that imbalance. An enemy flying, routinely and in mass, in a part of the sky that German skill could reach, but German industry could not deny him. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle flew in the high-altitude bombers, endured the thin air and the killing cold, the oxygen masks and the heated suits, the long hours in the freezing top of the sky, or if he worked in the factories that built the turbochargers and the oxygen systems and the heated suits that made high-altitude flight survivable, I would be grateful to hear his name and his unit in the comments. The men who fought in the high, cold sky endured an environment that punished them even when the enemy did not, and the workers who built the technologies of high flight are almost never remembered. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. 1945. The war ends and the technologies of high-altitude flight, the turbochargers, the pressurization, the life support systems, pass into the post-war world, laying foundations for the high-flying aircraft and eventually the pressurized airliners that would carry ordinary people through the top of the sky in comfort. One more case of a wartime achievement becoming a permanent part of the peace. So, here is the verdict. The German flak defense faced a fundamental and largely insoluble difficulty. The American bombers flew so high that the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire against them was severely degraded, and no amount of skill or courage or quantity of shells could fully overcome the physics of engaging targets at extreme altitude. The Germans understood the problem completely and fought it with everything they had, and could not defeat it. The Americans flew so high because they had mastered, at industrial scale, the two great problems of high-altitude flight: keeping engines powerful, with mass-produced turbochargers, and keeping men alive with mass-produced oxygen and heating systems, and had built the industrial capacity to equip entire fleets of heavy bombers for sustained operations in the killing thin cold air near the top of the sky. The flak gunner who watched his shells burst uselessly below the serene silver formations and could not understand how the enemy flew so high, was seeing the last version of the pattern that runs through this entire channel. He was not being outshot by better gunners. He was doing everything right. He was being defeated by an enemy who had solved a difficult technical problem at an industrial scale he could not match. An enemy who had made the top of the sky into a workable battlefield through the mass production of the technologies of high flight, and who therefore flew, routinely and in mass, above much of what the German defenses could do. The Germans understood the top of the sky as well as anyone. The Americans built the machines to own it, the turbochargers that let engines breathe, the oxygen and the heat that let men live, and mass-produced them until fleets of bombers could sail along in the thin, cold air above the reach of the guns. The Germans could reach the sky with their shells. The Americans flew above where the shells could reach, and kept 10 men alive in each bomber, in a cold and airless place no man was meant to be, because their industry could build by the thousand, the machines and the equipment that made the impossible sky a place where Americans could live and fight and win. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these. More systems, more decisions, more of the invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won and who came home. And remember this about the men in the high, cold sky. Nobody quite captures what it was to fly in the top of the sky in 1943. The thin air that would kill you in minutes without the mask. The cold so deep that a bare hand on metal would freeze to it. The hours of it, sealed in a freezing aluminum tube miles above the earth, breathing through a rubber mask, wrapped in an electrically heated suit, while the flak burst below and the fighters climbed to meet you. It was one of the most hostile environments any human being fought in during the entire war, and the enemy was only part of what could kill you up there. The men who flew there did so because their nation had built the machines and the equipment to make it possible. The turbochargers that carried them so high, the oxygen that let them breathe, the heat that kept them alive, and because in that high, cold place, above the reach of much of the flak, they could carry the war into the heart of the enemy. Mostly, when they climbed into the killing thin air near the top of the sky, the machines held, the oxygen flowed, the heat kept them alive, and they came home, because a nation of overwhelming industry had built by the thousand everything they needed to live and fight in a place no man was ever meant to be. They deserve to be remembered. The high-altitude crews, and the workers who built the turbochargers and the oxygen systems and the heated suits, by the cold and airless truth that the Americans conquered the top of the sky, not with a single miracle, but with the mass production of the humble, vital technologies that let engines breathe and men live, miles above the earth, above the reach of the guns.